There are moments in a person's life that arrive without ceremony, no warning, no particular quality of light. And yet they divide everything that came before from everything that comes after. For Verity Colston, that moment arrived on a Thursday morning in late August at the eastern boundary of Thornwycke estate, while she was elbow-deep in a drainage ditch, and a duke was making a fool of himself on the other side of a hawthorn hedge. For Alistair Faircross, Duke of Thornwycke, the moment arrived at precisely the same instant, though he would not understand what it was for another 6 days, and by then he would have said something irretrievable in public and found, to his considerable surprise, that he did not regret a word of it. This is the story of 6 days, a 60-year-old fraud, a flour bin, and the particular kind of argument that sounds like opposition and turns out to be something else entirely. The hawthorn hedge along the eastern boundary had not been properly cut in 3 years, and it showed. The late August growth had thickened it into something more wall than hedge. A solid mass of dark-leafed branches that ran the length of the disputed line and made it impossible to see clearly from either side. This suited Verity Colston well enough. She had been in the drainage ditch since before 7 in the morning, taking soil samples from the lower channel where the water table ran closest to the surface, and she had no particular wish to be observed doing it. She heard them before she saw them. Boots on dry ground, the sound of 2 men talking easily, and a third voice she did not know joining in. She kept her hands in the ditch and listened. "The filing is straightforward enough," said a voice she recognized as Alistair's steward, a careful man named Prewitt, who had been sending letters to T. Colston for the better part of 2 years. "Pettigrew's solicitor is expected at the assizes by Wednesday. The deed he's presenting claims the eastern acreage and all of Colston Farm. All of it." That was a different voice, younger, something between amusement and disbelief. "He means to take the farm as well?" "He does." The third voice was measured, dry, and carried the particular quality of a man accustomed to being listened to. Verity recognized it without having met its owner. Alistair Faircross, Duke of Thornwycke. She had read enough of his estate correspondence to know his habits of mind, if not his voice. "The deed is 60 years old, and signed by a man who has been dead for 40. I've seen stranger claims succeed." "Are you worried about the Colston woman contesting it?" the younger voice asked. There was a brief pause. When the Duke spoke again, there was a smile in it, not cruel but dismissive, and dismissive was quite enough. "The Colston woman," he said, "is, by all accounts, the sort who would correct a man's Latin at the altar. I've been told she argued with the Kesteven drainage board for 3 hours over a boundary stone and won, which I'm certain she found enormously satisfying." He paused again, and Verity heard him move, a step or 2 along the hedge line. But being argumentative and being right are not the same thing, and no one that quarrelsome could possibly have a clear reading of a 60-year-old deed. Only a fool would take her seriously. The younger voice laughed. Prewitt said nothing. Verity stood up. She straightened slowly because the ditch was deep and her boots were stuck in the lower clay, and she wanted to be entirely upright before she spoke. She was soaked to both elbows, her hair was coming loose from its pins, and there was mud on her chin that she did not bother to wipe away. She looked at the 3 men through the gap in the hawthorn. The steward she recognized, a young man with a startled expression, and the Duke himself, who was perhaps 34, and had the look of a man who had just said something he could not unsay. "Oh, in the deed," Verity said, at full volume and with the precise clarity of someone who has thought through every word before speaking, "is dated in the wrong regnal year. Reginald Pettigrew's grandfather misdated it by 4 years. which places the grant in a reign during which the land had already passed to Thornwycke by the Kesteven settlement. The deed is not forged. It is genuine, and it is wrong. And anyone who had actually read the 1780s survey ledger, rather than simply assuming the matter was settled, would know this. She paused. And so, apparently, are you. The steward stared at the hedge. The younger man went entirely still. The way people go still when they are watching something irreversible happen and want to be certain they remember it correctly. The Duke stared at Verity. She did not flinch. She had spent 2 years being invisible on purpose. A woman doing a man's job under a dead man's name, keeping her head down and her work meticulous and her opinions to herself in every formal context that might have exposed her. She had made peace with invisibility. But she had not made peace with being called a fool through a hedge by a man who had not read the documents. And she found, standing in the drainage ditch with clay on her boots and the August sun coming over the hawthorn, that she was not prepared to begin. Alistair Faircross looked at her for a long moment. "The regnal year?" he said carefully. "George II's 23rd year," Verity said. "The deed claims it. The land had already transferred 4 years earlier. If you would like me to show you the citation in the settlement records, I am available this afternoon." He looked at her for another moment. Something shifting in his expression that was not quite the dismissal she expected, and not quite anything she could name. "Who are you?" he asked. "Colston," Verity said. "V. Colston." She pulled her boot free from the clay, with a sound like a cork leaving a bottle, climbed out of the ditch, and walked back toward the farm without looking behind her. The 6 days began. By early afternoon, Alistair had sent Prewitt to request a consultation with T. Colston, land agent, whose name appeared on every survey, every tenant agreement, and every boundary filing associated with Colston Farm for the past 2 years. The letter Prewitt carried was formal and precise. The Duke of Thornwycke required the services of a land agent familiar with the Kesteven boundary records, on a temporary engagement basis, beginning immediately, in connection with the Pettigrew claim. Prewitt delivered the letter to the farm cottage and returned to Thornwycke with a reply. The reply said that T. Colston would attend at the gatehouse at 4 o'clock. Verity arrived at the gatehouse at 3:55, which was her habit. She had changed her dress and done something about her hair, though she had not been able to do anything about the fact that her hands were still faintly stained from the soil sample. She read the letter of engagement twice, standing in the gatehouse doorway while Prewitt waited. The letter was addressed to Mr. T. Colston. Verity looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at Prewitt, who was watching her with the expression of a man who was very good at his job and had not quite made the connection he was about to make. She could correct him. She understood that clearly. She could say, "The T stands for nothing. My name is Verity. And if the Duke wishes to engage me, he will do so under my own name or not at all." It was the honest course and the dignified one, and she knew exactly what would happen next. Prewitt would go back to Alistair Faircross and explain that T. Colston was a woman, and the engagement would be withdrawn on procedural grounds before she had set foot in the map room, because a woman could not hold a land agent's license, and everyone in Kesteven knew it. And Reginald Pettigrew's solicitor would be at the assizes on Wednesday, with a deed that nobody had properly refuted. "The terms are acceptable," Verity said. She signed the letter T. Colston, as she had been signing everything for 2 years, and handed it back to Prewitt. "The Duke will see you in the map room at 9 tomorrow," Prewitt said. "I'll be there at 8:50, Verity said, and walked back toward the farm. It was Thursday evening when Alistair shook hands with his new land agent in the Thornwycke gatehouse, having come down from the house to meet the engagement formally. He was brisk and courteous, as he was with all professional engagements. He said he was glad T. Colston could begin immediately. He said the boundary matter was urgent. He looked at the hand he was shaking and recognized it as the hand that had been elbow-deep in the drainage ditch that morning. And the recognition stopped behind his eyes without quite reaching his face. He looked up. Verity met his gaze with complete composure. Neither of them said anything about the morning. Neither of them said anything about the name on the letter. They shook hands, and the engagement was made. And by the time Alistair walked back up to the house, his new land agent had already turned away toward the farm lane, and the hawthorn hedge stood between them in the last of the Thursday light, overgrown and ordinary, and holding its silence perfectly. Reginald Pettigrew arrived at the Thornwycke gatehouse on Friday morning in a hired coach that was slightly too large for the lane, wearing a coat that was slightly too fine for a country call, and delivered his formal notification with the air of a man who believed the matter was already decided. He was perhaps 40, red-faced from the summer heat and from his own self-satisfaction. And he had a way of addressing Prewitt as though the steward were a footman, and the formality of the notification were a personal favor rather than a legal requirement. "The claim is filed with the Kesteven Assizes," Reginald announced, handing over the document with a small flourish. "My solicitor will present the deed Wednesday morning. I expect the matter to be concluded by noon." He paused, apparently for effect. "I should mention that I have considerable support among the local magistracy." "I'll inform the Duke," Prewitt said, and closed the gatehouse door. Alistair read the filing in the map room while Verity spread the 1780s survey ledger across the table beside it. The room smelled of old paper and candle wax, and the late summer light came in at a low angle through the eastern window, falling across the ledger pages in a way that made the old ink difficult to read. Verity had brought her own magnifying glass. She had also brought a set of notes she had been compiling for the past 2 years, which she placed at the far end of the table without comment. "Here," she said, setting her finger on a line in the ledger. The regnal year in Pettigrew's deed, George II's 23rd year, corresponds to 1750. But the Kesteven settlement, which transferred the eastern acreage to Thornwycke, was completed in 1746, George II's 19th year. She moved her finger across to the filing. His grandfather wrote 23rd when he meant 19th. Or rather, he wrote 23rd deliberately, because in 1750 the transfer was still recent enough that the error might not be caught immediately. And by the time anyone looked closely, the original settlement record had been misfiled. Alistair was quiet for a moment, reading the two documents side by side. "Not forged," he said. "Genuine and misdated," Verity said, "which is worse in a way, because everyone who has looked at it has assumed forgery and looked for the wrong evidence. The dating error is the evidence. It's right there on the face of the deed." "Your father found this." "My father spent the last 3 years of his life finding this," Verity said. He knew Reginald's grandfather had done it before. A near-identical claim against the Marsh holdings in 1798. It didn't succeed then, but the method was the same. Misdated deed, misfiled original, wait for the opposing family to lose track of their own records. Alistair set the filing down. "And your father left proof." "Somewhere," Verity said, and the word came out with a weight she did not intend. And she picked up the magnifying glass and turned back to the ledger. That afternoon, they walked the boundary line together. Alistair on the Thornwycke side, Verity on the farm side, the hawthorn hedge between them in the August heat. She had brought a soil sample from the lower channel, sealed in a small tin, and at the point where the hedge thinned, she held it out across the branches. "The drainage pattern runs north to east," she said, "which means the water table follows the lower field boundary, not the upper hedge line. Pettigrew's deed places the eastern boundary at the upper hedge, which would cut off the drainage channel and flood both the lower Thornwycke pasture and the farm's winter fields inside a season." She extended the tin further. "This is from the bottom of the channel. The clay composition matches the 1783 survey description of the lower boundary soil. It doesn't match anything in the upper field." Alistair reached across the hawthorn to take the tin. His fingers closed over hers on the lid before either of them quite intended it. Her hand was still extended. His had arrived a moment early, and for the space of 3 or 4 seconds they were both holding the tin and neither of them had moved. He could feel the dried clay on her knuckles. She could feel that he had not immediately let go. He looked at the tin. He looked at the label she had written on it in small, precise letters. He looked up at her. "North to east," he said. "North to east," Verity said. He took the tin. She took her hand back. They walked back toward the estate in the late afternoon heat on their separate sides of the hedge, and did not speak again until they reached the gatehouse. They spent Saturday and Sunday in the map room, and the map room in those 2 days became a particular kind of territory, not quite professional and not quite anything else, defined by the survey ledgers stacked along the far wall and the ongoing argument that neither of them was prepared to lose. Alistair was better at legal Latin. He had been educated for it, and he read the old boundary citations with the ease of someone who had been parsing such documents since university. Verity was better at reading the land itself. She knew the Kesteven marsh fields the way she knew her own handwriting. And when she looked at a survey description, she could see the actual ground beneath the words. On Saturday morning, she corrected 3 of his transcriptions from the 1780s ledger, pointing out each error with the same brisk clarity she had used at the hedge. On Saturday afternoon, he found a mistake in her acreage calculation, a transposed figure in the eastern total that altered the boundary measurement by 11 feet. 11 feet, she said, looking at the corrected figure. "It doesn't change the argument," Alistair said, "but it would have changed the testimony." Verity looked at the calculation for another moment, then moved it to the corrected column without comment and kept working. He noted the correction without making a point of it. This became their rhythm. The rain arrived without warning on Saturday afternoon, while they were standing at the boundary line for the 3rd time. Alistair holding the 1783 survey description and Verity crouching to check the drainage channel's current depth. The sky had been overcast all morning, and it broke without ceremony. A sudden, heavy downpour that soaked the ground in moments and turned the lane to mud within the minute. Verity straightened up. The rain was cold, which was unexpected for August, and she had not brought a coat. Alistair had already shrugged his off. He held it over both their heads, not offering it, simply raising it, one arm extended to cover her side as well as his, as though this were an entirely practical solution that required no particular acknowledgement. "I refuse," he said, squinting at the rain through the hawthorn, "to be blamed for you catching a chill before the hearing. Prewitt would never forgive me. Prewitt would find a way to file it in the boundary dispute," Verity said. "He would. He'd cite it as contributory negligence on the part of the estate." She did not thank him. She did not step away. They stood together under his coat in the August rain, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his arm above her. And they looked at the drainage channel filling with rainwater, and both of them were thinking about the soil sample, and neither of them said so. By Sunday evening, Reginald had made 2 attempts to charm Prewitt into providing him with access to the estate's historical boundary filings, once at the gatehouse and once, more boldly, at the estate office door. Both attempts had been met with politely immovable courtesy from Prewitt, who had been forestalled by counter-filings that appeared in the assize's record on Saturday afternoon and again on Sunday morning, each one signed T. Colston, each one citing a specific survey discrepancy that Reginald's solicitor had not anticipated. Alistair read the Sunday filing at his study desk. He turned it over and read the signature on the back. T. Colston. He set it down and looked at the door between his study and the map room, which was standing open, and through which he could see the lamp still burning at the map room table where Verity had been working for the past hour. He had not yet asked why she always signed that way. He was not yet certain he needed to. Lady Cassandra Renfield arrived at Thornwycke on Monday, a day earlier than expected, in a carriage that managed to be elegant without being ostentatious, which was, Alistair thought, rather typical of her. She was 31, dark-haired, and possessed of a quality of attention that made most people feel they had been accurately assessed within the first 5 minutes of her company. She was not unkind. She was simply perceptive. And she had learned that perceptiveness and kindness were not the same thing, though they could be practiced together with sufficient effort. She arrived at noon and spent the first 20 minutes of her visit touring the morning room and asking Prewitt sensible questions about the estate calendar. At 12:30, she walked into the map room to pay her respects to the Duke and found him and Verity standing at the same ledger. Alistair reading aloud a Latin boundary citation while Verity annotated the margin in pencil without looking up, and both of them in the middle of an argument about the weight of testimonial evidence versus documentary evidence in Kesteven boundary law that had apparently been running since breakfast. Cassandra stood in the doorway for approximately 2 minutes. Then she asked to speak with Alistair privately. He excused himself, and they went to the morning room. And Cassandra sat down and produced a letter from her reticule and placed it on the table between them. "I've been trying to find an occasion to give you that for 4 months," she said. "I think this one will do." Alistair looked at the letter without picking it up. It was addressed in her hand, sealed with her family crest. "Cassandra," he began. "I am in love with someone else," she said simply. "I have been for some time. He is a naval officer, which is not what my family had hoped for. And he has been at sea, which has made the situation difficult to resolve. He returned 3 weeks ago." She paused. "I have been looking for an occasion that would make the release easy for both sides. I think you will agree that this one has presented itself rather clearly." Alistair looked at the letter. "The parliamentary vote," he said. "My father can be managed," Cassandra said. "He will be considerably easier to manage once he understands that I intend to marry regardless of his preferences, which I am prepared to tell him directly. He responds better to clarity than to negotiation." She stood. "I intend to stay through Wednesday as your guest if you'll have me. I should like to see how the hearing goes." Alistair picked up the letter. He read the first paragraph, which contained the formal release language, and the second paragraph, which contained a sentence about the map room that was both accurate and rather pointed. "You're certain," he said. "Entirely," said Cassandra, and went to change for luncheon. Alistair returned to the map room without finishing the letter. He tucked it in his coat pocket and walked back to the table, where Verity had continued working in his absence and had filled half a page of margin notes in the time he'd been gone. "The 1783 citation," she said, without looking up. "I think the eastern measurement was taken from the wrong benchmark stone. If Pettigrew's solicitor uses the deed measurement, He'll be arguing from a point that doesn't exist on the current survey. "Show me," Alistair said. She turned the ledger toward him, and he leaned across the table to see the margin note, and his hand came to rest at the small of her back. Briefly, naturally, to steady himself against the table's edge as he reached. And then it stayed, a moment longer than the reaching required, warm and certain, while he read the notation she had written. Verity did not move. She was aware of his hand, with a precision that had nothing to do with the ledger. She kept her eyes on the margin note. "The benchmark stone," she said carefully. "Yes," he said. "You're right about the measurement." He straightened. His hand left her back. They returned to the documents. Reginald appeared in the map room doorway 20 minutes later, having talked his way past the estate office on the pretext of consulting Prewitt about a procedural matter. He found Alistair and Verity in the middle of an argument about an 1783 boundary survey. Specifically, about whether the eastern measurement in the original survey had been taken from the upper or lower benchmark stone, and what the difference in footage would mean for the deed's claimed acreage. The argument was technical and fast and conducted entirely in the shorthand of two people who had been reading the same documents for 4 days. Reginald stood in the doorway and tried twice to catch Prewitt's eye, and twice failed, because Prewitt was watching the argument with the expression of a man who was keeping very careful notes. Reginald looked at the map table. He looked at the two people standing on opposite sides of it, each one correcting the other with the ease of people who have stopped performing courtesy and started genuinely working. And he understood, with a sinking clarity, that his silk waistcoat did nothing to prevent, that he had walked into a room he could not win. He excused himself. Nobody acknowledged it. On Tuesday morning, Reginald's ally among the estate staff, a junior records clerk who had been cultivated over the past week with a combination of flattery and a small sum of money, informed Verity at the estate office door that T. Colston had not produced a surveyor's license and was therefore not permitted access to the estate records room. The grounds were procedural. The tone was apologetic in the way that things are apologetic when the person delivering them is perfectly aware they are not sorry. Verity looked at the clerk for a moment. "When was this decision made?" she asked. "This morning," the clerk said. "Mr. Prewitt has been informed." "And the Duke?" "The Duke has been informed," the clerk said, and had the grace to look at the floor. Alistair was formal at the morning briefing. He addressed Verity by surname, which he had not done since Friday. He did not contradict Prewitt's ruling about the records room. He sat at the head of the map room table and spoke about the hearing timeline in the tone of a man maintaining a professional distance that he had decided, for reasons of his own, to maintain. Verity understood it. She did not like it, but she understood it. He believed his obligation to Cassandra still stood because he had not read the letter properly, and he was trying to keep two duties from destroying each other before Wednesday. She understood the arithmetic of it. She was still furious. She left the estate without argument, walked back to Colston Farms cottage, and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the walls. Her father had left proof somewhere in this cottage. She had known it for 2 years. He had told her, in the last winter before he died, that he had found the original evidence of the Pettigrew fraud, the true 1780s survey, with his own marginal notation identifying the misdated deed and naming Reginald's grandfather directly, and that he had put it somewhere safe. Somewhere, he had said, with the particular dry humor that had been his version of affection, that no gentleman would think to look. Verity began with the study. She went through every drawer, every ledger, every rolled survey she had already checked twice. Nothing. She went through the bedroom, the parlor, the small room off the back passage that had been her father's workroom. Nothing. She stood in the kitchen doorway in the early afternoon light and looked at the room her father had spent 30 years working in. And she thought about where a woman who ran a household would hide something irreplaceable. She started pulling tins. She had been through the salt box, the tea caddy, the sugar tin, and the spice rack by the time the light outside had gone from afternoon to evening. The kitchen looked as though it had been searched by someone who intended to leave no tin upright, which was accurate. Verity sat on the kitchen floor in the middle of it, surrounded by emptied containers and scattered paper, with a candle she had lit when the window light failed, and then looked at the flour bin. It was large, a proper farmhouse flour bin, deep enough to hold a month's supply, heavy enough that it had not moved from its corner in 30 years. She had checked the top of it. She had not checked the bottom. She was still looking at it when she heard boots on the front step. The door opened. Alistair Faircross stood in the kitchen doorway in his riding coat, without having sent word ahead, looking at the state of the kitchen and then at Verity on the floor. She looked back at him. "The records room will be open to you tomorrow," he said. "I had already planned to be there whether you said so or not," Verity said. He looked at the scattered tins. He looked at the flour bin. He looked at the candle she was holding, and then he came into the kitchen, navigated around a fallen salt box, and sat down on the kitchen floor beside her. He did not explain himself further. He held out his hand for the candle. She gave it to him. She went through the flour bin by candlelight, both hands deep in the flour, working from the top downward in careful layers, while Alistair held the light steady and said nothing useful and stayed anyway. The flour was fine and cold and went up to her wrists, then her forearms, and she worked methodically, feeling for anything that wasn't flour. Her fingers found it near the bottom, a shape, cylindrical and firm, wrapped in something that didn't give the way paper would. She got both hands around it and lifted it out, and it came up through the flour trailing a small white cloud, and she set it on the kitchen floor between them. It was a roll of paper wrapped in oilcloth, sealed at both ends with wax. Her father's handwriting was on the outside, 2 words in his small, careful script. "Hold this." Verity looked at it for a moment. Then she broke the seal and unrolled it on the kitchen floor, smoothing it flat with flour-white hands while Alistair brought the candle close. It was a survey. The original 1780s survey, not a copy, not a transcription, but the document itself, in her father's hand and in the hand of the original Thornwycke surveyor, dated in the correct regnal year, with the eastern boundary measurement taken from the correct benchmark stone. In the margin, in her father's later hand, was a notation she recognized from his working style, precise, referenced, devastating. Pettigrew deed claims G2 Wadwire 23. Settlement record G2 19. This survey G2 19. Grandfather's error deliberate. Referrals 1798. Marsh claim same method. Name Edmund Pettigrew, deed agent. And below it, in her father's hand, V will know where to find this. Verity sat very still. Alistair read the notation. He read it twice. He looked at the name in the margin, and then at Verity, who was looking at her father's handwriting with an expression that was not grief exactly. It was something older and quieter than grief. The feeling of being known by someone who was no longer there to be thanked. "He knew you'd look here," Alistair said. "He knew I run a kitchen," Verity said. "And he knew that no gentleman surveyor would ever think to look in a flour bin." She smoothed the edge of the survey flat. He was right on both counts. Alistair looked at her. "The records room will be open at first light," he said. "I know," Verity said. "I told you. I was going to be there anyway." "I know," he said. "I came anyway." They stayed on the kitchen floor, until the candle had burned low, going through the survey line by line, and the flour dried on Verity's hands, and the August night came through the cottage windows, and neither of them spoke about anything except the document, which was exactly what was needed, and also, in its way, everything else. Wednesday morning arrived with a quality of light that felt deliberate, clear and hard and bright, the kind of morning that makes courtrooms feel more consequential than they usually are. The Kesteven Assizes occupied a stone building at the edge of the market town, and by 9 o'clock the gallery was fuller than the case strictly warranted. News of the Pettigrew claim had circulated through the parish in the way that legal disputes involving land always circulate. Quickly, specifically, and with considerable editorial commentary. Reginald arrived first, with his solicitor and 2 witnesses, and arranged himself at the claimant's table with the careful positioning of a man who has rehearsed this moment. He was wearing his finest coat. He had had his boots blacked twice. Alistair arrived with Prewitt and took his seat at the respondent's table. He set a leather document case on the table in front of him and did not open it. Cassandra was in the gallery, 3rd row, with the particular composed expression of someone who knows how the next hour will go and intends to enjoy it. The magistrate called the matter. Reginald's solicitor rose and began to present the deed with considerable self-congratulation. The document's age, its provenance, its clear grant of both the eastern acreage and Colston farm. The signatures of witnesses long dead who could not be cross-examined. The solicitor was good at his work. He moved through the deed's provisions with practiced efficiency, and he was perhaps 3 sentences from the point at which he would formally request the magistrate's signature on the transfer order. Alistair stood up. "Your Honor," he said, "I have a document to present." The solicitor stopped. Reginald's expression shifted from satisfaction to something more cautious. Alistair opened the leather case and produced the oilcloth-wrapped survey. He unrolled it on the table, set his hands flat on either side to hold it open, and addressed the magistrate directly. "This is the original 1780 survey of the Thornwycke eastern boundary, in the hand of the estate surveyor, and co-signed by the land agent of record at the time. It is dated in George II's 19th regnal year, 1746, which corresponds to the date of the Kesteven settlement that transferred the eastern acreage to Thornwycke." He indicated the deed on the solicitor's table. "The deed presented by Mr. Pettigrew claims the grant occurred in George II's 23rd year, 1750. The land had already transferred 4 years before the date cited in the deed. The deed is genuine. The date is wrong." The courtroom was quiet. "Furthermore," Alistair continued, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there a moment ago, something that cost him, which the gallery could hear and which Cassandra, in the 3rd row, heard with particular clarity. The marginal notation in this survey, written by the late Thomas Colston, land agent of Thornwycke estate, identifies this misdating as deliberate. It references an earlier, near-identical fraud attempted by Reginald Pettigrew's grandfather in 1798 against the Marsh holdings. The notation names the grandfather directly. The method was the same. Misdated deed, misfiled original, wait for the opposing family to lose track of their own records. He looked at the magistrate. The Colston family did not lose track. Reginald's solicitor was on his feet. "Your Honor, the provenance of this document is established by the co-signature of the Thornwycke surveyor, whose name appears in the estate records for the relevant period, and by the dating, which can be verified against the Kesteven settlement record held by this court." Alistair paused. "I am prepared to testify to both." The magistrate looked at the survey. He looked at the deed. He looked at Reginald, who had gone the color of old brick. "Mr. Faircross," the magistrate said, "you may proceed." Alistair testified to the regnal year discrepancy, to the survey's correspondence with the settlement record, to the marginal notation and its citation of the 1798 precedent. He was precise and unhurried, and he did not once look at Reginald, which was, in its way, the most devastating thing he did. When he had finished, he remained standing. "Your Honor," he said, "I have one further statement to make, which is not strictly relevant to the boundary question, but which I consider relevant to this court and to the people present in this gallery." The magistrate raised an eyebrow. "Proceed." "I had intended to announce, following this hearing, my engagement to Lady Cassandra Renfield, in fulfillment of a political understanding made by my late father." Alistair's voice was steady. "I will not be making that announcement. Lady Cassandra has released me from the understanding, which I mention only because I am aware that several people in this gallery have an interest in the dukedom's political arrangements and deserve to hear it from me directly." He paused. "I have spent 6 days arguing with a woman who was right about nearly everything, including the deed, including the survey, and, I think it is fair to say, including me. I consider it relevant to say so publicly, and I consider it relevant to name her properly." He looked at the magistrate. "The survey was found, and the case was built by Verity Colston, land agent of Thornwycke Estate. She's been filing under the name T. Colston for 2 years. The T stands for Thomas, her father, who died 2 winters ago. She has been doing his work, in his name, without license and without recognition, because the alternative was watching the tenants lose their protections. I would ask the court to note her name." The magistrate looked at him for a moment. "The court notes it," the magistrate said. "The boundary and Colston Farm remain as surveyed in 1783. The deed presented by the claimant is dismissed." He looked at Reginald. "Mr. Pettigrew, sit down." Reginald sat down with great speed and considerable color. In the 3rd row of the gallery, Cassandra laughed, a clear, genuine sound, entirely relieved, not wounded at all, and did not bother to hide it. The boundary hedge in the last of the summer light was exactly what it had always been. An overgrown line of hawthorn that needed cutting, unremarkable and ordinary. The kind of thing you walked past without thinking. It was not the edge of anything disputed anymore. It was just a hedge. Verity was standing on the farm side of it when Alistair came down the lane from the estate, still in his hearing coat, the leather document case under his arm. The light was going gold and long across the fields, and the drainage channel was running quietly in the lower ground, and the hawthorn smelled of late summer and nothing in particular. He stopped on his side of the hedge. "In 10 years of running this dukedom," he said, "I have never once done something this reckless." Verity looked at him through the gap in the hawthorn. "You testified to a fact in a court of law," she said. "That is not generally considered reckless." "I meant the other part. The part where you announced publicly that you'd spent a week being wrong about things. The part," he said, "where I intend to keep doing it." She looked at him for another moment. Then she pushed through the gap in the hawthorn, the same gap she had stood in on Thursday morning with clay on her boots and contempt in her voice. And she kissed him, briefly and precisely, the way she did most things. And she felt his hand come up to her face with the same certainty as it had come to her back in the map room. And neither of them said anything about it, because there was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in a courtroom in front of a magistrate in a gallery, and Cassandra Renfield laughing in the 3rd row. The hedge stood between their land and his, overgrown and ordinary. And it didn't matter at all. In the weeks that followed, Alistair's father's old solicitor, a small, careful man named Fitch, who had been managing the dukedom's legal affairs for 30 years, came quietly to Colston Farm one afternoon without ceremony and without announcement. He sat at the kitchen table, which had been restored to order, and produced a set of documents that he placed in front of Verity without preamble. "These backdate your formal appointment as land agent of Thornwycke estate by 2 years," Fitch said. "They are signed by the Duke and witnessed by myself and Mr. Prewitt. They establish your license as of the date you began the work." He paused. "There will be no public announcement. The Duke felt you would prefer it this way." Verity looked at the documents. She thought of 2 years of surveys filed under a dead man's name, 2 years of tenant agreements kept and boundary stones checked and drainage channels measured, 2 years of being invisible on purpose so that the work could continue. "He was right," she said. Fitch nodded, gathered his hat, and left without making a speech about it, which was exactly the kind of recognition she would have chosen for herself. The map room at Thornwycke was repainted that autumn, the old label stripped from the door and a new one put in its place. "Estate Office. On the Duchess here. Verity Colston, land agent." The T was deliberate. Verity had chosen it herself, and Alistair had not suggested she change it, because he understood by then that the name was not a disguise. It was a record, and records mattered. The door between the estate office and the Duke's study was left open by mutual, unspoken agreement, and it stayed open through the autumn and the winter and into the following spring, and the work continued, and the tenants stayed fed. And the hawthorn hedge along the eastern boundary was finally cut back in October, which made the lane considerably easier to walk. It had been, as Alistair told his friend some months later, the same friend who had gone very still on Thursday morning when the woman in the drainage ditch stood up, the most productive 6 days of his adult life. His friend asked whether he meant the boundary case. Alistair considered the question. "Both," he said.